Imagine waking up one morning and the world has ended. Not from war, not from invasion, but because someone, somewhere, misread a radar signal. For 45 years, this was reality. Every single day, humanity lived minutes away from total annihilation. American children hid under school desks. Soviet families listened to propaganda speakers in apartment blocks. And in underground bunkers on both sides, officers sat with their fingers on buttons that could destroy civilization. Two superpowers, 70,000 nuclear weapons, one planet. The Cold War killed millions in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other countries you've never heard about. It divided families. It built walls through cities. It sent spies into the shadows and astronauts to the moon. It created the world you live in today, the internet, GPS, the global economy, even the international tensions you see in the news. And it ended not with a bang, but with people saying enough and tearing down walls with their bare hands. This is the complete story, from the ashes of World War II to the fall of the Soviet Union. Every crisis, every close call, every proxy war, every spy, every hero, and every villain. The story of how we survived the most dangerous era in human history, and why we can never forget it. Imagine living in a world where two superpowers hold enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization multiple times over. Where children practice hiding under desks at school, believing it might save them from atomic bombs. Where families build underground bunkers stocked with canned food and water, preparing for an apocalypse that could arrive at any moment. Where a single miscalculation, one misunderstood radar signal, could trigger the end of everything. This wasn't science fiction. This was reality for billions of people for nearly half a century. Welcome to the story of the Cold War, a conflict unlike any other in human history. A war where the two most powerful nations on Earth never directly fired a shot at each other. Yet their rivalry shaped the destiny of every continent, sparked dozens of proxy wars, sent humans to the moon, and brought our species closer to extinction than ever before. From 1947 to 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in an ideological, political, economic, and military struggle that divided the world into two opposing camps: democracy versus communism, capitalism versus socialism, freedom versus control, or at least that's how each side saw it. This is the entire history of the Cold War, a story of espionage and astronauts, of walls built and walls torn down, of dictators propped up and democracies undermined, of brilliant minds and catastrophic mistakes, of courage and paranoia, of humanity's darkest moments and its most hopeful triumphs. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just what happened, but why it happened, how close we came to annihilation, and why the echoes of this conflict still reverberate through our world today. So let's begin where all great conflicts begin, not with the first shot fired, but with the seeds planted long before. To understand the Cold War, we need to rewind to an unlikely alliance born from desperate necessity. It's 1941. Nazi Germany has conquered most of Europe. Hitler's armies are pushing deep into the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. In the Pacific, Imperial Japan is expanding its empire with brutal efficiency. The world is burning. In this darkest hour, two nations with fundamentally opposing worldviews, the United States and the Soviet Union, find themselves fighting the same enemies. The Allies are born not from friendship, but from survival. American capitalism and Soviet communism, natural adversaries, join forces against fascism. Think of it like two rival gangs forced to work together when a bigger threat comes to town. They'll cooperate, sure, but trust? That's another matter entirely. The alliance works. By 1945, after millions of deaths and unimaginable destruction, the Allies emerge victorious. Hitler is dead, Germany is defeated, and Japan surrenders after atomic bombs devastate Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world breathes a collective sigh of relief. But here's where our story really begins. With the common enemy defeated, what happens to this marriage of convenience? Picture the final meeting of the big three Allied leaders at Potsdam in July 1945. There's Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who had transformed Russia from a peasant society into an industrial superpower through brutal forced industrialization and purges that killed millions of his own people. There's Harry Truman, the new American president who had only recently assumed office after Franklin Roosevelt's death, representing a democratic, capitalist nation that emerged from the war as the world's leading economic power. And there's Winston Churchill, soon to be replaced by Clement Attlee, representing a British Empire exhausted by 6 years of war. These men are ostensibly allies, but the cracks are already showing. Stalin wants to ensure the Soviet Union is never invaded again. It had happened twice in 30 years, costing tens of millions of Soviet lives. His solution? Create a buffer zone of friendly governments in Eastern Europe. Control Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany to keep potential invaders far from Soviet borders. The Americans and British see this differently. They watch as Soviet troops refuse to leave the territories they liberated from the Nazis. They see rigged elections, opposition leaders arrested or murdered, and communist parties taking control. To them, Stalin isn't creating a defensive buffer. He's building an empire. And there's a deeper ideological chasm here. The Soviet Union operates on Marxist-Leninist principles, the belief that capitalism inevitably exploits workers, that class struggle defines history, and that communism must eventually spread worldwide for true justice to prevail. Soviet leaders genuinely believe they're on the right side of history, that capitalism will collapse under its own contradictions. The United States, meanwhile, champions liberal democracy and free market capitalism. Americans believe that individual liberty, democratic governance, and free enterprise create prosperity and freedom. They see communism as totalitarian, crushing individual rights, controlling every aspect of life, and inevitably leading to a dictatorship. These aren't just political differences. These are fundamentally incompatible visions of how human society should be organized. And now, both sides have massive armies, advanced weapons, and global ambitions. The wartime alliance was always temporary. What nobody quite realized yet was that the peace would be anything but. By early 1946, both sides are growing increasingly suspicious. Soviet espionage had penetrated the Manhattan Project, giving Stalin knowledge of atomic weapons before Truman even informed him. American and British leaders felt betrayed. Meanwhile, Stalin sees the American atomic monopoly as a threat and accelerates Soviet nuclear research. Then comes a moment that crystallizes everything. On March 5, 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill delivers a speech that gives the emerging conflict its most enduring image. With President Truman sitting behind him, Churchill declares, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." An iron curtain. Europe is being divided. The western half, democratic, capitalist, oriented towards America. The eastern half, communist, controlled by Moscow. Two worlds emerging from the ashes of one war, already preparing for the next. But why Cold War? Why didn't these tensions explode into World War III? The answer sits in those atomic bombs that ended World War II. Both sides now have, or soon will have, the power to destroy entire cities in seconds.
As nuclear arsenals grow, a terrifying logic emerges. Direct war between the superpowers means mutual annihilation. So instead, the conflict becomes indirect. The war turns cold, fought through proxies, espionage, propaganda, economic competition, and the constant threat of going hot. It's a chess game where every move matters, but knocking over the board means killing everyone in the room. The stage is set. The players are in position. The Cold War is about to begin in earnest.
The year is 1947, and Europe is in ruins. Cities are rubble. Economies are shattered. Millions are homeless, hungry, and desperate. And in this desperation, communism is spreading. Here's something crucial to understand. Communism wasn't forcing its way into Western Europe with Soviet tanks. People were choosing it. When you've lost everything, when capitalism seems to have failed you, when you're standing in bread lines wondering how to feed your children, the communist promise of economic equality and state-guaranteed employment sounds pretty appealing. Communist parties in France and Italy are gaining massive support. Greece is in the midst of a civil war between communists and the government. Turkey is under Soviet pressure to grant access to the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And Britain, bankrupted by the war, tells America it can no longer support anti-communist forces in Greece and Turkey. The dominoes are wobbling. Enter George F. Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow, who sends an 8,000-word telegram that becomes the most influential diplomatic cable in American history. Kennan's long telegram argues that Soviet expansion is inevitable, not because of temporary circumstances, but because of the fundamental nature of the Soviet system. It needs an external enemy to justify its internal repression. It will push and probe for weakness everywhere. But, and this is crucial, Kennan argues that the Soviet Union is also cautious. It will retreat when faced with strong resistance. The solution? Containment. Don't try to roll back communism where it already exists. That's too risky. Instead, prevent it from spreading further. Draw lines. Stand firm. Wait for the internal contradictions of the Soviet system to eventually cause its collapse. This becomes American strategy for the next 40 years. President Truman acts quickly. In March 1947, he addresses Congress and announces what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. America will support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. In practical terms, this means $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. More broadly, it means America is committing to fight communist expansion globally. Think about the magnitude of this shift. For 150 years, American foreign policy had been relatively isolationist. Stay out of European affairs. Focus on the Western Hemisphere. Now, America is declaring itself the guardian of freedom worldwide. The entire trajectory of American foreign policy pivots in this moment. But money for Greece and Turkey isn't enough. Secretary of State George Marshall proposes something unprecedented, the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. Over 4 years, America pours $13 billion, equivalent to over $150 billion today, into rebuilding Western Europe. Not just former allies like Britain and France, but former enemies too. West Germany receives massive aid. The logic is partly humanitarian, partly strategic. Prosperous democracies don't go communist. Economic recovery strengthens capitalism and creates trading partners. But there's also a brilliant political move here. The Marshall Plan is offered to all European nations, including those under Soviet influence. Stalin faces a dilemma. If he lets Eastern European countries accept Marshall Plan aid, they'll develop economic ties to the West and potentially slip from Soviet control. If he refuses on their behalf, he's exposed as the one dividing Europe. He chooses control over cooperation, forbidding Eastern European nations from participating Never in the history of the world has a city of this size ever been supplied by air. Berlin needs 4,000 tons of supplies daily. No one has ever attempted anything like this. Truman gives the order anyway. What follows is one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in history. American and British planes begin flying round the clock, landing every few minutes at Berlin's airports. Pilots sleep in shifts. Ground crews work until they collapse. The operation is refined to incredible efficiency. Planes are unloaded in 20 minutes, often while engines are still running. At its peak, planes are landing every 30 seconds. In one 24-hour period, 1,398 flights delivered 12,941 tons of supplies. Pilots start dropping candy attached to tiny parachutes for Berlin's children, earning the nickname Candy Bombers. The airlift works. Berlin doesn't starve. The city holds. After 318 days, on May 12, 1949, Stalin admits defeat and lifts the blockade. It's the first major confrontation of the Cold War, and the West has won without firing a shot. But the crisis has consequences. The Western Allies accelerate plans for West Germany. On May 23, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany is established. The Soviets respond by creating the German Democratic Republic in East Germany on October 7, 1949. One Germany becomes two. The division of Europe is complete. And there's another consequence. During the Berlin crisis, Western European nations realize they need a formal military alliance with America. On April 4, 1949, 12 nations sign a treaty creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. An attack on one is an attack on all. American military power is now permanently committed to defending Western Europe. The Soviets see this as aggressive encirclement. They'll respond 5 years later with their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. Two military blocs, heavily armed, facing each other across the Iron Curtain. The world has taken on the shape it will keep for decades. But just when it seems like the Cold War has settled into a stable, if tense, pattern, everything is about to change, because the American atomic monopoly is about to end. August 29, 1949. In the remote steppes of Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb. American intelligence detects the test within days. Truman announces it publicly on September 23rd. The reaction in America is shock and near panic. The scientists said it would take the Soviets years, maybe a decade, to develop atomic weapons. How did they do it so fast? The answer? Espionage. Soviet spies had penetrated the Manhattan Project, passing critical secrets to Moscow. Klaus Fuchs, Julius Rosenberg, and others provided detailed information that accelerated Soviet nuclear development by years. The American atomic monopoly, the ultimate security guarantee, is gone after just 4 years. The nuclear arms race begins in earnest. But we're just getting started. On November 1, 1952, America tests something far more powerful, the world's first hydrogen bomb. The device, codenamed Ivy Mike, is detonated on Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The explosion completely vaporizes the island, leaving only a massive underwater crater. Its yield? 10.4 megatons, more than 700 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Think about that for a moment. One bomb erases an island, thousands of times more powerful than the weapons that ended World War II. The Soviets test their first hydrogen bomb less than a year later, in August 1953. The thermonuclear age has arrived. Let me paint you a picture of what this means. By the 1960s, both sides will have nuclear arsenals that can destroy all major cities multiple times over. One single American submarine will carry more destructive power than all weapons used in all wars in human history combined. The Soviet Union will build bombs so large, the Tsar Bomba, tested in 1961, yielding 50 megatons, that they serve no practical military purpose except to demonstrate capability and instill terror. The doctrine that emerges from this madness has an appropriately mad name: Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD. The acronym is perfect because the logic is insane, yet it works. Here's how it goes. If you attack me with nuclear weapons, I will definitely retain enough nuclear forces to completely destroy you in retaliation. Since your attack guarantees your own destruction, you won't attack. Neither side can win, so neither side tries. Peace through the promise of mutual extinction. Human civilization balanced on the edge of a nuclear knife, kept from falling only by the certainty that falling means dying together. Both sides develop elaborate systems to ensure retaliation is always possible. Bombers stay in the air 24/7, always ready. Missiles are placed in hardened underground silos. Submarines carrying nuclear weapons hide beneath the oceans, undetectable, able to strike even if the homeland is destroyed. The nuclear triad, bombers, land-based missiles, submarines, ensures that no first strike, no matter how devastating, can prevent retaliation. Early warning systems are built to detect incoming missiles. American radar installations in Greenland, Alaska, and elsewhere scan the skies constantly. The Soviets build their own network. Both sides develop systems where, if leaders are killed in a first strike, the military can still launch a counterstrike. The Soviets allegedly create the dead hand system, a semi-automatic system that can launch nuclear weapons even if Moscow is destroyed and all leaders are dead. Think about the psychology of this. Military officers sit in underground bunkers, keys ready, orders clear. If you receive the launch code, you will end the world. Every day, every shift, for years. One false alarm, one technical glitch, one misinterpreted radar signal away from Armageddon. And there are false alarms. In 1960, American radar systems detect a massive Soviet missile attack. Turns out, the radar bounced off the moon. In 1979, a training tape simulating a Soviet attack is accidentally loaded into NORAD systems, and for a few terrifying minutes, American commanders believe they're under attack. In 1983, Soviet early warning systems report 5 American missiles incoming. A Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov makes a judgment call that it's a false alarm and doesn't report it up the chain. He's right. It was a system error. Petrov likely saved the world. We're alive today partly because of people like Petrov who, in moments of supreme crisis, chose to trust their intuition over their instruments. But the terror isn't just military. It seeps into civilian life. In America, the government produces films teaching children to duck and cover, hide under your desk when you see the flash of a nuclear explosion, as if wood and linoleum can protect you from weapons that vaporize islands. Cities conduct nuclear attack drills. Families build fallout shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned goods and water, preparing to live underground while radiation fades. The nuclear threat becomes cultural. Science fiction movies envision post-apocalyptic wastelands. Books like On the Beach imagine the final days of humanity after nuclear war. Songs like Barry Maguire's Eve of Destruction capture the anxiety of a generation growing up under the mushroom cloud. The famous Doomsday Clock, created by nuclear scientists, shows how close humanity is to midnight, nuclear annihilation. It fluctuates throughout the Cold War, but never moves far from midnight. This is the existential backdrop for everything else that happens in the Cold War. Every crisis, every confrontation carries the shadow of nuclear holocaust. The stakes are always absolute. Miscalculate, and billions die. The nuclear arms race also drives technological innovation at an unprecedented pace. To deliver nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth, both sides develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. These same rockets become the foundation for space programs. The nuclear standoff accelerates computer development. Both sides need faster systems to track missiles and calculate strike options. Nuclear submarines drive advances in marine engineering. The search for early warning leads to satellite technology. The threat of nuclear war is also, paradoxically, a stabilizing force. Neither superpower can risk direct conflict. This pushes competition into other arenas: proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, economic competition, technological rivalry. The Cold War becomes a global chess game played on multiple boards simultaneously. But while nuclear weapons prevent World War III, they don't prevent war. They just change where and how it happens. And as the 1950s dawn, war is about to erupt in East Asia, proving that the Cold War, while cold between the superpowers, will be blazing hot for millions of others.
June 25, 1950, Sunday morning. North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, surge across the 38th parallel, the line dividing North and South Korea. Within days, they capture Seoul, the South Korean capital. Within weeks, South Korean and American forces are pushed to a tiny perimeter around the port city of Pusan, in the southeast corner of the peninsula. The Cold War just turned hot. Let's rewind briefly. Korea, like Germany, was divided after World War II. The Soviets occupied the north, the Americans the south. The division was supposed to be temporary, but like in Germany, it became permanent. By 1950, there are two Korean states: North Korea, led by communist dictator Kim Il-sung with Soviet backing, and South Korea, led by authoritarian anti-communist Syngman Rhee with American support. Neither leader accepts the division. Both claim to be the legitimate government of all Korea. The question isn't whether Korea will be unified, but who will do it and how. Kim Il-sung travels to Moscow and Beijing, seeking approval for an invasion. Stalin is initially cautious. He doesn't want to provoke American intervention, but several factors change his mind. First, the Americans have pulled most troops out of South Korea and seem to have written it off as outside their defense perimeter. Second, China has recently gone communist, giving the socialist camp new confidence and power. Third, the Soviet atomic bomb means America can't threaten nuclear attack without facing retaliation. Stalin greenlights the invasion, but insists that China, not the Soviet Union, will provide support if things go wrong. He wants Korean unification under communism, but he doesn't want World War III. The invasion catches everyone off guard. South Korean forces crumble. President Truman faces a critical decision: respond or let South Korea fall. Truman chooses to respond. His reasoning is pure containment logic. If communism is allowed to expand through military conquest, it will be encouraged to try again elsewhere. Korea becomes a test. A line must be held. The United Nations Security Council passes a resolution condemning North Korea and authorizing military action to repel the invasion. The Soviets, who could have vetoed this, are boycotting the Security Council at the time over a different issue: the refusal to seat Communist China. Their absence allows the resolution to pass. It's one of history's great tactical blunders. American forces, along with contingents from 15 other UN member nations, deploy to Korea under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the legendary World War II commander. The early months are desperate. American and South Korean forces cling to the Pusan perimeter, barely holding on. Then MacArthur executes a brilliant and audacious gambit, an amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind North Korean lines. Despite terrible odds, the tides and terrain make Incheon nearly impossible for amphibious assault. The landing succeeds. North Korean supply lines are cut, Seoul is recaptured. North Korean forces retreat in disarray. Now the tables turn. UN forces push north, crossing the 38th parallel into North Korea itself. The mission has shifted from defending South Korea to liberating North Korea. MacArthur's forces push toward the Yalu River, the border with China. MacArthur assures Washington that China won't intervene. He's catastrophically wrong. On November 25, 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer soldiers pour across the Yalu River into Korea. It's one of the largest military interventions in history. Chinese forces, using human wave attacks and superior numbers, overwhelm UN forces. The advance becomes a retreat, then nearly a rout. It's the longest retreat in American military history. The war stabilizes around the 38th parallel, basically where it started. Now it becomes a grinding stalemate. Trench warfare, reminiscent of World War I. For 2 more years, men fight and die over hilltops and ridgelines that get captured and recaptured, gaining nothing. MacArthur wants to escalate, bomb China, perhaps use nuclear weapons, expand the war. President Truman refuses. This is the central dilemma of the Cold War. If you escalate, you risk World War III and nuclear war. If you don't escalate, you fight limited wars with limited goals, which is frustrating, costly, and difficult to explain to the public. MacArthur publicly criticizes Truman's strategy. Truman fires him. It's a crucial assertion of civilian control over the military, and a statement that Cold War conflicts will be kept limited. The Korean War finally ends on July 27, 1953, with an armistice. Not a peace treaty, just an agreement to stop fighting. The border returns to roughly the 38th parallel. Korea remains divided. Families are separated. Millions are dead. Perhaps 2.5 million Korean civilians, 500,000 North Korean soldiers, 400,000 South Korean soldiers, 180,000 Chinese soldiers, and 40,000 UN forces, including 36,000 Americans. What does the Korean War tell us about the Cold War? First, containment works. South Korea wasn't conquered, but it's expensive and bloody. Second, the Cold War will be fought in the Third World, in places like Korea, where local conflicts become proxy battles between the superpowers. Third, these conflicts will be limited. No nuclear weapons used, no attacks on the homelands of the superpowers. But for the people of Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and other battlefields to come, the Cold War will be anything but cold. The Korean War also solidifies the Cold War's fundamental structure. NATO is strengthened. American military spending triples and never comes back down. The permanent national security state is born. A massive military, intelligence agencies, defense contractors, all kept on a permanent war footing even during peace. And there's another consequence. The Korean War convinces American leaders that communist expansion is coordinated from Moscow, that local communist movements are puppets of Soviet imperialism rather than indigenous nationalist movements. This belief will lead to repeated interventions in countries around the world, often supporting dictators as long as they're anti-communist, sometimes overthrowing elected governments if they seem too friendly to communism. The stage is set for a global struggle that will touch every continent and last decades. But before we continue with proxy wars, we need to understand another dimension of the Cold War, the spy versus spy world of intelligence operations, where the conflict is fought in the shadows.
Picture this. It's 1956 in Vienna, a neutral city where East meets West. A man walks into the American embassy and says he wants to defect. His name is Pyotr Popov, and he's a Soviet military intelligence officer. For the next few years, Popov provides the CIA with Soviet military secrets, including information about Soviet missiles and war plans. Then, in 1959, he's exposed, betrayed by a CIA officer who was actually a Soviet double agent. Popov is arrested, tried for treason, and executed. This is the Secret War, a shadowy conflict of spies, double agents, defectors, dead drops, hidden cameras, coded messages, and deadly betrayals. While politicians negotiate and armies face off, intelligence agencies fight a hidden battle that's just as critical to the Cold War's outcome. Both sides build massive intelligence and covert operations agencies. For America, there's the Central Intelligence Agency, created in 1947. For the Soviets, the KGB, the Committee for State Security, along with the GRU for military intelligence. Britain has MI6. The Mossad represents Israeli interests, and every major nation has its own service. These agencies become governments within governments, operating with enormous budgets and minimal oversight. Their missions go far beyond traditional spying. They recruit and run agents in enemy territory, steal secrets, conduct sabotage, spread propaganda, influence elections, overthrow governments, and occasionally assassinate enemies. The rules, such as they are different in this world. Plausible deniability becomes an art form. If an operation goes wrong, governments can disavow knowledge. Agents know they're expendable. Let me tell you about some of the most significant operations and figures in this secret war. Start with the Berlin Tunnel, Operation Gold. In 1954-55, American and British intelligence dig a tunnel from West Berlin into East Berlin and tap Soviet military communication cables. For nearly a year, they intercept thousands of hours of conversations, providing invaluable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities and intentions. Then the operation is compromised, betrayed by George Blake, a British intelligence officer who was actually a Soviet double agent. But here's the twist. The Soviets knew about the tunnel from the beginning, but couldn't shut it down without exposing Blake, so they let it continue while feeding some disinformation through the tapped lines. This is the wilderness of mirrors, as one CIA officer called it. A world where you never know who's really working for whom, where exposed operations might have been allowed to continue, where even your successes might be manipulations by the other side. The Soviets excel at penetration, recruiting insiders in Western intelligence agencies. Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer, provides the West with crucial information about Soviet missiles, including data that helps Kennedy navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's also Kim Philby, a high-ranking British intelligence officer who spied for the Soviets for decades, betraying countless operations and agents. The Cambridge Five, Philby and 4 others, penetrate the highest levels of British intelligence. Their betrayals send dozens of Western agents to their deaths. The Americans have successes too. The U-2 spy plane, flying at altitudes Soviet fighters can't reach, photographs vast swaths of Soviet territory, revealing military bases, missile sites, and industrial facilities. These flights continue until 1960, when the U-2, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, is shot down by a Soviet missile. Powers survives and is captured, turning a covert operation into a public diplomatic crisis. Eisenhower is caught in a lie. He denied the U.S. conducted such flights, and a planned summit with Khrushchev collapses. But it's not just about stealing secrets. Intelligence agencies conduct covert operations to influence events, often in the Third World. Iran, 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mosaddegh nationalizes Iran's oil industry, threatening Western oil company profits. He's also accepting support from the Tudeh Party. The CIA, working with British intelligence, orchestrates Operation Ajax, bribing politicians, spreading propaganda, organizing protests and riots. Mosaddegh is overthrown in a coup, and the Shah, a pro-Western monarch, consolidates power. It's a short-term success, but a long-term catastrophe. The Shah's authoritarian rule breeds resentment that explodes in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, creating an anti-American theocracy that exists to this day. Guatemala, 1954.
President Jacobo Arbenz implements land reforms that threaten the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with vast holdings in Guatemala. The CIA, claiming Arbenz as a communist threat, orchestrates Operation PBSU Success. They arm and train a rebel force, conduct psychological warfare, and eventually, Arbenz is overthrown. A military dictatorship follows, leading to decades of civil war and repression. Hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans will die. Congo, 1961. Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister of the newly independent Congo, is seen as too radical and possibly communist-leaning. The CIA plots to assassinate him. Before they can act, Lumumba is captured by Congolese rivals, possibly with CIA assistance, and executed. The Congo descends into chaos, eventually leading to the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, one of Africa's most corrupt and brutal rulers. But he's pro-Western, so American aid flows freely. These operations establish a pattern that repeats across the Cold War. Support any government, no matter how authoritarian or brutal, as long as it's anti-communist. Democracy is less important than alignment. And if a government, even a democratically elected one, leans left or nationalizes resources owned by Western corporations, it's a communist threat that must be eliminated. The Soviets do the same, of course. They support national liberation movements and arm insurgencies around the world. They provide military aid to Cuba, North Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and many others. Soviet intelligence agencies conduct their own covert operations, assassinations, and disinformation campaigns. Both sides recruit extensively in universities, targeting idealistic young people who believe in their cause. Some become agents. Others become unwitting assets, manipulated to provide information or influence without realizing who they're really working for. The secret war also becomes a technological race. Both sides develop increasingly sophisticated methods of surveillance and communication. Dead drops give way to more advanced signal methods. Invisible ink, microdots, encrypted radio transmissions, and eventually, satellites and computers transform tradecraft. One of the most important intelligence operations happens over years and doesn't involve a single spy. It's signals intelligence, intercepting and decoding enemy communications. Both sides build massive facilities to listen to radio traffic, phone calls, and data transmissions. The Americans established the National Security Agency, which grows to dwarf the CIA in size and budget. Its mission: collect everything, decrypt everything, know everything. The Soviets create similar organizations. Every electronic communication becomes a potential intelligence source. The secret war has another purpose beyond gathering intelligence. It allows both sides to compete without going to open war. A failed covert operation is embarrassing, but not worth starting World War III over. If intelligence officers are caught, they can be disavowed, exchanged, or tried. The spy versus spy world, while dangerous for the participants, serves as a pressure valve for the larger conflict. But there are costs. Democracy suffers when intelligence agencies operate in secret with massive budgets and little accountability. Covert operations often violate international law and the stated values of the nations conducting them. And sometimes, these secret operations spiral out of control, bringing the superpowers dangerously close to direct confrontation. Which brings us to one of the most dangerous moments in human history, when the secret war and the nuclear threat converged on a small island 90 miles from American shores. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days when the world held its breath and came closer to nuclear war than ever before or since.
October 16, 1962. President John F. Kennedy is shown photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. The images reveal something terrifying. The Soviet Union is secretly installing nuclear missiles on the island, just 90 miles from Florida. medium-range ballistic missiles that can reach Washington, D.C. in minutes. Missiles that could kill 80 million Americans before the United States could respond. Kennedy stares at the photographs. One of his advisors will later recall that the president's face showed more stress than at any other moment of his presidency. And for good reason. The next 13 days will bring humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation. To understand how we got here, let's back up to January 1, 1959. That's when Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista and take control of Cuba. Initially, the United States isn't sure what to make of Castro. He's not openly communist, but as Castro nationalizes American-owned properties and businesses, relations deteriorate rapidly. By 1960, Cuba has turned to the Soviet Union for economic and military support. Eisenhower authorizes the CIA to train Cuban exiles for an invasion to overthrow Castro. When Kennedy takes office in January 1961, he inherits this plan. Despite misgivings, he approves it. April 17, 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion begins. It's a catastrophic failure. The 1,400 Cuban exiles dropped at the Bay of Pigs are outnumbered, poorly supported, and quickly defeated. Castro's forces kill or capture nearly all of them. Kennedy, who refused to provide air support to avoid direct American involvement, takes responsibility for the disaster. The Bay of Pigs has multiple consequences. Castro, now convinced that America wants to destroy him, moves closer to the Soviet Union. Kennedy is humiliated and seen as weak, especially by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And the CIA continues Operation Mongoose, a program of sabotage, assassination attempts, and covert operations against Cuba. The US and Cuba are in an undeclared war. Meanwhile, Khrushchev has his own problems. The Soviet Union is behind in the nuclear arms race. America has nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, right on the Soviet border. Khrushchev has ICBMs, but they're expensive and unreliable. Medium-range missiles in Cuba would instantly level the playing field and demonstrate to the world that the Soviet Union can protect its allies. So, in the summer of 1962, Khrushchev makes a fateful decision: secretly install nuclear missiles in Cuba. He convinces Castro to allow it, promising that the missiles will deter American invasion. The operation is codenamed Anadir, and it's huge, not just missiles, but thousands of Soviet troops, nuclear warheads, bombers, and even tactical nuclear weapons to defend the island. The Soviets go to extraordinary lengths to keep the operation secret. Equipment is disguised, troops are told they're going to the Arctic, ships take circuitous routes, and it almost works. Almost. But on October 14, a U-2 flight photographs the missile sites under construction. When Kennedy sees the photos 2 days later, the crisis begins. Kennedy convenes a secret group called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM for short. For the next 6 days, they debate in secret what to do. The Hawks want immediate military action, airstrikes to destroy the missiles, followed by an invasion of Cuba. The Doves worry that attacking Soviet forces means war with the Soviet Union, which means nuclear war. Think about the pressure these men are under. They're making decisions that could literally end civilization, and they have to make them quickly, with incomplete information under enormous stress. And they can't go public without triggering a panic or forcing Khrushchev into a corner where backing down means losing face. Several options are debated. Do nothing, but that means accepting Soviet missiles 90 miles from America. Diplomatic pressure, but the missiles will be operational soon. Airstrikes, but the Air Force can't guarantee they'll get all the missiles, and what if the Soviets retaliate in Berlin or Turkey? Invasion, but that means thousands of casualties and possibly nuclear war. Blockade, stop Soviet ships from bringing more missiles, give Khrushchev time to back down.
Kennedy chooses the blockade,
But he calls it a quarantine because a blockade is technically an act of war. On October 22nd, he goes on national television and addresses the nation. 70 million Americans watch as Kennedy reveals the missiles and announces the quarantine. Soviet ships carrying missiles to Cuba must turn back or be stopped by the U.S. Navy. Kennedy demands the missiles be removed. The world watches in horror as the superpowers hurtle toward confrontation. The Soviet response is defiant. Khrushchev calls the quarantine an act of aggression. Soviet ships continue toward Cuba. Soviet forces in Cuba go to high alert. In the United States, Strategic Air Command goes to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached, just one step from nuclear war. B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons circle in the air, ready to strike. Missile crews stand ready in their silos. October 24th. Soviet ships approach the quarantine line. American destroyers move to intercept. This is it. If Soviet ships don't turn back, American ships will stop them by force. Soviet submarines escort the cargo ships, ready to fight. Then, at 10:25 a.m., word comes. The Soviet ships have stopped in the water. They're holding position, not crossing the line. Secretary of State Dean Rusk whispers to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. But the crisis isn't over. The missiles already in Cuba are still there, and they're becoming operational. Intelligence reports suggest some might already be ready to launch. Castro is pressing Khrushchev to use the missiles if America invades. The situation remains desperate. October 26th. Khrushchev sends Kennedy a long, emotional letter offering to remove the missiles if the United States promises not to invade Cuba. Kennedy is ready to accept. Then, October 27th, Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cold War. Everything goes wrong at once. A U-2 pilot accidentally strays into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Soviet fighters scramble to intercept. American fighters, armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles, scramble to escort him back. Any combat could trigger escalation. In Cuba, a different U-2 is shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot, Rudolf Anderson. American military commanders push for immediate retaliation. And Khrushchev sends a second letter, this one harder than the first. He'll remove missiles from Cuba if America removes missiles from Turkey. This is a problem. Kennedy has privately considered removing the obsolete Turkish missiles anyway, but doing it publicly, under pressure, looks like weakness. Meanwhile, American forces prepare to invade Cuba. The date is set October 29th. Soviet forces in Cuba, unbeknownst to the Americans, have tactical nuclear weapons and authority to use them if attacked. An American invasion would likely trigger nuclear weapons use, which would trigger American nuclear response, which would trigger Soviet nuclear response. Armageddon. In Moscow, Soviet commanders push for a harder line. In Washington, American commanders push for airstrikes and invasion. Both leaders feel the situation slipping out of control. And then, in a submarine near Cuba, something happens that nobody learns about until decades later. A Soviet submarine, designated B-59, is being harassed by American destroyers dropping practice depth charges to force it to surface. The submarine has been submerged for days. It's hot, carbon dioxide is building up, the batteries are dying, the crew is on edge. The submarine commander thinks war may have already started. He decides to use his nuclear torpedo. To fire, 3 officers must agree. To do. The third, Vasili Arkhipov, refuses. He convinces the commander to surface instead. We came that close. One man's decision made in a hot submarine suffering from carbon dioxide poisoning prevented nuclear war. Back in Washington, Kennedy and his advisors work frantically to find a solution. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, meets secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. He delivers a message. The Turkish missiles will be removed, but this must remain secret. Publicly, the deal is only about Cuba. No invasion in exchange for removing the missiles.
Turkey must not know it was part of the deal. Khrushchev, running out of options and terrified of where this is heading, accepts. On October 28th, he announces that Soviet missiles will be removed from Cuba. Kennedy publicly promises not to invade Cuba. Secretly, the Turkish missiles will go. The world breathes a collective sigh of relief. Humanity has stepped back from the abyss. The crisis is over. But the experience shakes both leaders profoundly. Kennedy, in a speech at American University the following June, calls for rethinking the Cold War, for finding ways to coexist without threatening mutual annihilation. Khrushchev agrees. Direct communication between Moscow and Washington is established, the famous hotline, so leaders can talk directly in a crisis rather than relying on slow diplomatic channels. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty is signed, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. It's a small step, but it's the first arms control agreement of the Cold War. The realization that they nearly destroyed everything pushes both sides toward at least trying to manage the competition more carefully. The Cuban Missile Crisis teaches critical lessons. First, nuclear weapons create unacceptable risks. Even rational leaders trying to avoid war can end up on the brink. Second, both sides need ways to communicate and de-escalate. Third, and perhaps most important, neither side can push too hard because the other side, backed into a corner, might do something desperate. But what doesn't change is the fundamental competition continues. The arms race continues. Proxy wars continue. The Cold War continues. The crisis taught both sides to be more careful, but it didn't end the conflict. And even as superpower relations improve slightly, a new crisis is brewing in Southeast Asia. Vietnam is about to become America's longest war and one of the most divisive conflicts in American history.
Close your eyes and imagine you're an American soldier in Vietnam. It's 1968. You're 19 years old, drafted, dropped into a jungle environment you've never experienced. The heat is suffocating, 90 degrees with 100% humidity. The vegetation is so thick you can barely see 10 feet ahead. You're wearing 60 pounds of equipment, searching for an enemy you can't see, but who can see you. You don't know who's friendly and who's enemy. The village you secured yesterday might be feeding Viet Cong guerrillas tonight. The child walking down the path might be carrying a grenade. The ground you're walking on might be hiding punji stakes, sharpened bamboo covered in feces, waiting to puncture your foot and cause agonizing infection. The trail ahead might be rigged with mines or booby traps made from your own unexploded ordnance. You're fighting for a cause that made sense in your briefing, but makes less sense every day. You're told you're stopping communism, defending freedom. But the South Vietnamese government you're defending is corrupt and authoritarian. The people you're supposedly saving often seem to hate you. Your superior firepower doesn't seem to matter against an enemy that disappears into the jungle or across borders you're not allowed to cross. This is Vietnam, and it's where the Cold War logic of containment collides with the reality of guerrilla warfare, nationalism, and a determined enemy willing to sacrifice everything. Let's understand how America ended up here. Vietnam had been a French colony called Indochina. During World War II, Japan occupied it. A Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh led resistance against the Japanese. When the war ended, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence. Here's the crucial thing. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, yes, but he was first and foremost a nationalist. He wanted Vietnam independent and unified. He actually quoted the American Declaration of Independence in Vietnam's Declaration of Independence and sought American support against the returning French. But this is 1945. The Cold War is beginning,
and Americans see the world through an anti-communist lens. Ho Chi Minh is communist, therefore he must be a Soviet puppet. So America supports France's attempt to re-establish colonial control. Big mistake. The Vietnamese fight a brutal guerrilla war against the French. In 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnamese forces decisively defeat the French. It's a stunning victory, a colonized people defeating a European power. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, Vietnam is temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's communists control the north. A pro-Western government controls the south. Elections are scheduled in 1956 to reunify the country. Those elections never happen. The United States, fearing Ho Chi Minh would win, he almost certainly would have, supports South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem's refusal to hold them. Diem, a Catholic in a largely Buddhist country, establishes an authoritarian regime. He's corrupt, nepotistic, and brutal to political opponents. But he's anti-communist, so American aid flows. North Vietnam, meanwhile, begins supporting insurgents in South Vietnam, the Viet Cong. It starts small: propaganda, recruitment, small-scale attacks. The Viet Cong are South Vietnamese communists, but they receive support, training, and supplies from North Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex network of paths running through Laos and Cambodia. As Diem's government grows more unpopular, the insurgency grows. In 1963, Buddhist monks set themselves on fire in protest. Diem's regime is clearly failing. With American approval, South Vietnamese generals stage a coup and execute Diem. The coup solves nothing. South Vietnam cycles through weak governments, the Viet Cong grow stronger, and American involvement deepens. President Kennedy had sent military advisors, over 16,000 by the time of his assassination in November 1963. President Johnson inherits this growing commitment. He faces a choice: withdraw and let South Vietnam fall to communism, or escalate American involvement. Johnson chooses escalation, driven by containment logic and fear of appearing weak. In August 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attack American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The details are murky. One attack probably happened, a second probably didn't, but Johnson uses the incident to get congressional approval for military action. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution gives the president power to wage war without a formal declaration. It's a blank check, and Johnson uses it. In March 1965, the first American combat troops land in Vietnam. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops are there. The American strategy is attrition. Kill so many enemy soldiers that they give up. General Westmoreland, the American commander, believes superior firepower and technology will prevail. The U.S. military has helicopters, jet fighters, B-52 bombers, napalm, and eventually chemical defoliants like Agent Orange to destroy jungle cover. They conduct search and destroy missions, measuring success by body count.
But it doesn't work. Here's why. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army aren't fighting a conventional war. They're fighting a guerrilla war mixed with conventional operations. They avoid large battles they can't win, attack when advantageous, and melt away when pressured. They hide in tunnels, in villages, across borders in Cambodia and Laos. They're fighting for their homeland and are willing to absorb enormous casualties. American troops, meanwhile, are fighting a one-year tour of duty in a country most can't find on a map before their orders arrive. They don't speak the language. They can't tell friend from enemy. And they're increasingly asking why they're there. The war escalates in brutality. Americans conduct massive bombing campaigns. Operation Rolling Thunder drops more tonnage on North Vietnam than all bombs dropped in World War II. Villages suspected of supporting the Viet Cong are destroyed. Millions of Vietnamese become refugees. The chemical defoliant Agent Orange causes cancer and birth defects that affect generations. Napalm earns villages. And atrocities happen. In March 1968, American soldiers massacre between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians in the village of My Lai. Old men, women, children, babies. They're gunned down, some raped first, bodies dumped in ditches. When the story breaks, it shocks the world and crystallizes opposition to the war. The Viet Cong commit atrocities too, assassinating village leaders, executing suspected collaborators, and using terror tactics. This is a brutal war where civilians suffer horribly from both sides. Then comes the Tet Offensive. On January 30, 1968, during the Tet Lunar New Year holiday, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launch coordinated attacks on cities across South Vietnam. They attack the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They capture the city of Hue and hold it for weeks. Militarily, Tet is an American victory. The attackers are eventually repulsed with heavy losses. But psychologically, it's a devastating defeat. Americans have been told the war is being won, that enemy forces are nearly defeated. Suddenly, the enemy is attacking everywhere, even the U.S. Embassy. The credibility gap, the difference between official statements and reality, becomes a chasm. American public opinion turns decisively against the war. Protests erupt across the country. Students march, occupy buildings, clash with police. "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" becomes a chant. The war divides America like nothing since the Civil War. Families split over it. The country is traumatized. In March 1968, President Johnson announces he won't seek re-election. The war has destroyed his presidency. Richard Nixon wins the 1968 election, partly by promising a secret plan to end the war. Nixon's plan involves Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting while American troops gradually withdraw. But he also escalates in other ways, secretly bombing Cambodia to destroy Viet Cong sanctuaries. When this becomes public, more protests erupt. In May 1970, National Guard troops fire on student protesters at Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 students. America is tearing itself apart. The war continues for years. Nixon pursues peace talks in Paris while continuing military operations. In 1972, he orders massive bombing of North Vietnam, the Christmas bombings, to force concessions. It works partially. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords are signed. American troops will withdraw. North and South Vietnam will remain separate. Prisoners of war will be returned. The last American combat troops leave Vietnam in March 1973. But the war isn't over for the Vietnamese. Fighting continues between North and South. American aid to South Vietnam dwindles as Congress, weary of the war, cuts funding. In early 1975, North Vietnamese forces launch a final offensive. The South Vietnamese military collapses. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crash through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The last Americans are evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof. South Vietnam ceases to exist. Vietnam is reunified under communist control. America's longest war is over. The cost is staggering. 58,000 American deaths, over 300,000 wounded, many with psychological trauma that will haunt them for life. For Vietnam, perhaps 2 million civilians dead, 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters dead, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers dead, millions wounded, the country devastated, contaminated with unexploded ordnance and chemical weapons. And for what? Vietnam is communist, exactly what America fought to prevent. The domino theory, that if Vietnam fell, all Southeast Asia would go communist, proves wrong. Vietnam has actually fought wars against its communist neighbors, China and Cambodia. The war didn't stop communism's spread, it just killed millions and traumatized a generation. Vietnam teaches hard lessons. Military power has limits. Guerrilla wars can't be won through attrition. Supporting unpopular governments is a losing strategy. And perhaps most important, Not every conflict is really about the Cold War. Sometimes local nationalism and self-determination matter more than ideology. The war also changes America profoundly. Trust in government plummets. The military draft becomes politically impossible and is abolished. A generation becomes cynical about American power and purposes. No more Vietnams becomes a rallying cry. And yet the lessons don't always stick. Future leaders will repeat similar mistakes in different places. But while Vietnam dominates American attention in the 1960s and 70s, the Cold War continues in other theaters. The Soviet Union faces its own Vietnam in Afghanistan. Latin America becomes a Cold War battleground. Africa sees superpower competition play out in proxy wars. And through it all, the arms race accelerates, the space race continues, and both sides keep searching for advantage. Let's turn our attention now to how the Cold War played out in other parts of the world, where local conflicts became Cold War proxy battles.
The Cold War wasn't just about Washington and Moscow, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, capitalism and communism. It was truly global, touching every continent, influencing every region, turning local conflicts into pieces of a worldwide chess game. Let me take you on a world tour of Cold War conflicts, showing how this superpower rivalry shaped the destinies of nations far from the main centers of power. Africa. When African nations gained independence in the 1960s and 70s, they immediately became Cold War battlegrounds. Both superpowers saw opportunity, the Soviets to spread socialism and gain allies, the Americans to prevent communist expansion and secure resources. Angola provides a perfect example. When Portugal finally granted independence in 1975, 3 different movements competed for control. The MPLA, backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba, controlled the capital. UNITA and FNLA, backed by the United States, South Africa, and Zaire, controlled other regions. It became a proxy war, with foreign troops and advisors flooding in. Cuba sent thousands of troops to support the MPLA. Castro wanted to spread revolution and prove Cuba's importance. South Africa invaded to support UNITA and prevent a communist Angola from supporting anti-apartheid movements. The CIA funneled money and weapons. The war raged for decades, killing hundreds of thousands, leaving Angola devastated and the MPLA eventually victorious but ruling a ruined country. Ethiopia saw a similar pattern. A Marxist military junta, the Derg, overthrew Haile Selassie in 1974 and aligned with the Soviet Union. Somalia, previously Soviet-aligned, switched to the American side. The two countries fought the Ogaden War in 1977-78 with superpower backing on opposite sides. Cuban troops again deployed, this time helping Ethiopia. The war ended with Ethiopian victory but left both nations impoverished and destabilized. Across Africa, Cold War logic corrupted development. Both superpowers supported brutal dictators as long as they were on the right side. Mobutu in Zaire, one of history's most corrupt leaders, received billions in American aid because he was anti-communist. The Soviets supported equally terrible regimes that claimed to be socialist. African development was sacrificed to Cold War positioning. Latin America. Latin America was considered America's backyard, but it became a major Cold War battlefield after Cuba went communist. The United States was determined to prevent another Cuba and intervened repeatedly, often overthrowing democratically elected governments that seemed too left-wing. Chile is the classic case. Salvador Allende, a Marxist, was democratically elected president in 1970. The CIA, with Nixon's approval, worked to destabilize his government. The economy was sabotaged, the military was encouraged to rebel. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet staged a coup. Allende died. Killed or suicide, we still don't know. and Pinochet established a brutal dictatorship that tortured and killed thousands. The United States supported Pinochet because he was anti-communist, overlooking his atrocities. This pattern repeated across Latin America. In Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and elsewhere, military dictatorships received American support. These regimes conducted dirty wars against their own citizens, disappearing tens of thousands of people, all justified as necessary to fight communism. Nicaragua saw this dynamic play out differently. In 1979, the Sandinista movement overthrew the Somoza dictatorship. The Sandinistas, inspired by Cuba and receiving Soviet support, alarmed Washington. President Reagan authorized the CIA to support anti-Sandinista rebels called Contras. The result was a devastating war that killed 30,000 Nicaraguans. The Contras, despite American support, couldn't win. When Congress cut off funding, the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran and funneled the proceeds to the Contras. The Iran-Contra scandal. It was illegal, constitutional crisis level stuff, but justified as necessary to fight communism. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras all saw similar conflicts. Left-wing guerrillas fought right-wing governments backed by the United States. Death squads murdered suspected leftists. Whole villages were massacred. Hundreds of thousands died. Millions became refugees. The Middle East. The Middle East was particularly complex because Cold War competition overlaid regional conflicts, religious divisions, and the Israel-Palestine issue. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. In 1979, the Soviet-backed communist government in Afghanistan was losing control to Islamic insurgents. The Soviets invaded, installing a more pliant leader and deploying 100,000 troops. They thought it would be quick. It wasn't. Afghan Mujahideen fighters, using guerrilla tactics and armed with American weapons funneled through Pakistan, ground down the Soviet military. The Soviets had superior firepower, but they couldn't control the countryside. Soviet helicopters were shot down by American Stinger missiles. Soviet soldiers came home in coffins or addicted to drugs. The war became deeply unpopular in the Soviet Union. The Americans saw it as payback for Vietnam. The Soviets were now stuck in an unwinnable guerrilla war. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski later admitted that the U.S. had actually supported the Mujahideen before the Soviet invasion, hoping to provoke it. The strategy worked brilliantly. The Afghan War became a disaster for the Soviet Union, contributing to its eventual collapse. But there were consequences nobody anticipated. The Mujahideen included foreign fighters inspired by radical Islam, including a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. The weapons and training provided by the CIA would later be used against America. The Taliban would emerge from these fighters. Afghanistan would become a failed state. The Soviet-Afghan War planted seeds that sprouted into 9/11 and America's own Afghan War decades later. The Middle East also saw the superpowers on opposite sides of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Soviet Union armed Egypt, Syria, and other Arab states. The United States provided massive military aid to Israel. When wars erupted, 1967, 1973, both superpowers had to manage the crisis carefully to prevent direct confrontation. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Soviets threatened to intervene directly to save surrounded Egyptian forces. Nixon, despite being embroiled in the Watergate scandal, put American forces on high nuclear alert, DEFCON 3. The crisis passed, but it showed how regional conflicts could trigger superpower confrontation. Asia. Beyond Vietnam, Cold War conflicts raged across Asia. In Indonesia, a failed communist coup in 1965 triggered a massive anti-communist massacre. The military, with CIA support, killed between 500,000 and 1 million suspected communists. It was one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century, but because the victims were communists, the West barely noticed. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, led by Pol Pot, came to power partly as a result of American bombing destabilizing the country. Once in power, they attempted to create a radical communist, agrarian utopia and ended up murdering 1.7 million of their own people, 25% of Cambodia's population. Yet, because the Khmer Rouge was opposed to Vietnam, which had invaded to overthrow them, the United States tacitly supported them. Cold War logic at its most morally bankrupt. The arms race and détente. Through all these proxy wars, the arms race continued. Both sides developed weapons of staggering destructive power. Multiple, independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, allowed one missile to hit multiple targets. Accuracy improved so missiles could destroy hardened targets like enemy missile silos. Submarines grew quieter, harder to detect. The arsenals grew to absurd levels. Over 60,000 nuclear warheads by the mid-1980s, enough to destroy civilization many times over. But there were efforts to manage the competition. In the early 1970s, the United States and Soviet Union pursued détente, a relaxation of tensions. President Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev held summits, signed agreements, and expanded trade. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, produced treaties limiting certain weapons systems. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty limited missile defense systems, ironically to preserve MAD. If one side could defend against nuclear attack, they might be tempted to launch a first strike. Mutual vulnerability became mutual safety. But détente was fragile. Conservative critics argued America was being duped, that the Soviets were violating agreements. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 killed détente. President Carter withdrew SALT II from Senate consideration and imposed sanctions. President Reagan, elected in 1980, took a much harder line. Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire and predicted that communism would end up on the ash heap of history. He launched the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. He proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or popularly called Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system. Most scientists said it was impossible, but it scared the Soviets. They couldn't afford to match American spending. Reagan also supported anti-communist movements worldwide, the Reagan Doctrine. The Contras in Nicaragua, UNITA in Angola, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and others received American support. The Cold War seemed to be heating up again. But then something happened that few people predicted and nobody quite understood at the time. The Soviet Union began to collapse from within.
March 11, 1985. A relatively young Soviet leader named Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party. He's 54, young by Soviet leadership standards. He's energetic, charismatic, and he's inheriting a system in crisis. The Soviet economy is stagnant. Consumer goods are scarce. Technology is decades behind the West. The war in Afghanistan is draining resources and morale. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986 will reveal the incompetence and dishonesty of the system. The arms race with America is unsustainable. The Soviet Union is, in essence, a third world country with first world weapons, and it's collapsing under its own contradictions. Gorbachev understands that fundamental reforms are necessary. He introduces two key concepts: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost means more freedom of speech, more open discussion of problems, less censorship. Perestroika means economic reforms, allowing some market mechanisms, decentralizing control. These seem like reasonable reforms to save the system. Instead, they unleash forces that will destroy it. Think about it. For 70 years, the Soviet system maintained control through repression and propaganda. Criticism was forbidden, information was controlled, dissent was crushed. Now, suddenly, people can speak more freely, can criticize the system, can learn about the lies they've been told. It's like removing the lid from a pressure cooker that's been building steam for decades. Once people start questioning one aspect of the system, they question everything. If the party lied about Chernobyl, what else did they lie about? If the economy is failing, despite being supposedly superior to capitalism, maybe capitalism isn't inferior after all. If satellite states can choose their own path, why do we need the Soviet Union? In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Walesa, challenges communist control. It started as a trade union in 1980, but became a mass movement for democracy. The government imposed martial law to suppress it, but Solidarity survived underground. By 1989, emboldened by glasnost, it's forcing negotiations. In June 1989, Poland holds partially free elections. Solidarity wins a stunning victory. By August, Poland has a non-communist prime minister for the first time since World War II. The dominoes are starting to fall. Hungary is next. Reformers in the Hungarian Communist Party begin liberalizing. In May 1989, they start dismantling the barbed wire fence along the border with Austria. By September, the border is effectively open. East Germans, desperate to escape their stagnant system, flock to Hungary and cross into Austria, then to West Germany. Thousands escape this way. Meanwhile, in East Germany, protests are growing. Every Monday, people gather in Leipzig and other cities chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. The crowds grow from hundreds to thousands to hundreds of thousands. The government, uncertain if Soviet troops will support repression and afraid of another Tiananmen Square massacre, China had just brutally crushed pro-democracy protests in June 1989, does nothing. On November 9, 1989, a confused East German spokesman announces that travel restrictions are being lifted. Reporters ask, "When does this take effect?" He stammers, "Immediately, without delay." It's a miscommunication. The policy wasn't supposed to start yet, but it doesn't matter. East Berliners rush to the wall. Guards, receiving no orders, don't know what to do. The crowds overwhelm them. People start crossing. Then they start celebrating. Then they start attacking the wall with sledgehammers and pickaxes. The most powerful symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall that has divided the city for 28 years, is being torn down by jubilant crowds. West Berliners join them. Strangers embrace. Champagne flows. People dance on top of the wall. David Hasselhoff performs. It's one of the great moments of joy in human history. The division of Germany, of Europe, of the world, it's ending. And it's happening peacefully. No shots fired, no tanks rolling, just people saying enough, and a system too exhausted, too hollow, too morally bankrupt to resist. Czechoslovakia follows. Massive protests in Prague force the communist government to negotiate. By the end of December, dissident playwright Václav Havel is president. It's called the Velvet Revolution because of how smooth and non-violent it is. Romania is different. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu tries to suppress protests with violence, but the army refuses to shoot protesters and switches sides. Ceausescu and his wife flee, are captured, and after a brief show trial are executed on Christmas Day 1989. It's the only violent revolution in the Eastern Bloc, but even here the old order falls quickly. Bulgaria, Albania, and other satellite states follow similar patterns. By the end of 1989, every communist government in Eastern Europe except the Soviet Union itself has fallen or is in the process of falling. The Soviet Empire has evaporated. Gorbachev, to his credit, doesn't send in tanks.
Unlike previous Soviet leaders who crushed Hungarian and Czechoslovakian reform movements, Gorbachev lets the satellites go. He understands that holding them would require massive force and would doom any chance of Soviet reform. He also, perhaps, understands that these revolutions are morally right. But losing the satellites weakens the Soviet Union itself. If Poles and Czechs can have democracy, why not Russians? If East Germany can reunite with the West, what about the Soviet republics? Why should Ukraine, the Baltic states, or Central Asian republics remain in the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union itself begins to fracture. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, declare independence in 1990. They had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, and they want out. Other republics start asserting sovereignty. In Russia itself, Boris Yeltsin, a reformer who had been pushed out of the leadership by Gorbachev, becomes a rival power center. In June 1991, he's elected president of the Russian Republic in the Soviet Union's first free election. He represents something new, democracy, perhaps even capitalism. Hardline communists are alarmed. In August 1991, they stage a coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea. They declare a state of emergency and send tanks into Moscow. But the coup fails spectacularly. Yeltsin famously stands on a tank outside the Russian parliament building and rallies opposition. Crowds surround the parliament to defend it. Soldiers refuse to fire on civilians. Within 3 days, the coup collapses. The organizers are arrested. But the Soviet Union is finished. If communist hardliners tried and failed to save it, what's left? The republics accelerate their independence movements. The Soviet Union is disintegrating. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigns as Soviet president. That evening, the Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor is raised in its place. The Soviet Union officially ceases to exist on December 26, 1991. The Cold War is over. Not through nuclear war, not through military conquest, but through the internal collapse of one of the participants. The Soviet system, built on the promise of creating a workers' paradise, imploded under the weight of its own contradictions, inefficiencies, and moral bankruptcy. Think about what this means. For 45 years, the world was divided into two armed camps. Billions of dollars were spent on weapons. Millions died in proxy wars. Every international crisis carried the potential for nuclear Armageddon. And then, in just a few years, one side just simply gave up, walked away, dissolved. President George H.W. Bush, in a speech in January 1992, declares, "By the grace of God, America won the Cold War." But did America win? Or did the Soviet Union simply lose? There's a difference. The USSR collapsed primarily because of internal problems: economic stagnation, political rigidity, imperial overstretch, and a system that couldn't adapt or compete. America's role was important. The arms race strained Soviet resources, containment prevented Soviet expansion, support for dissidents and reform movements helped. But ultimately, the Soviet system failed on its own merits, or lack thereof.
The Cold War is over, but its legacy shapes our world today. Let me show you how. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it had approximately 35,000 nuclear weapons spread across multiple republics. The fear that these weapons might fall into the wrong hands was very real. Through careful diplomacy, the United States worked with the former Soviet republics to secure these weapons. Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan agreed to give up their nuclear arsenals in exchange for security guarantees. Russia inherited the Soviet arsenal. Today, Russia and the United States still possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons.
The threat of nuclear war hasn't disappeared. It's just less immediate than during the Cold War. Both countries still maintain large arsenals on alert. Arms control treaties have reduced numbers but not eliminated the threat. And nuclear weapons have spread. Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea all have them now. The fear isn't just superpower conflict anymore, but regional nuclear wars, accidents, or terrorists obtaining nuclear material. President Eisenhower, in his 1961 farewell address, warned about the military-industrial complex. The vast network of defense contractors, military bases, and government agencies created to fight the Cold War. He worried it would become a permanent feature of American life. He was right. Even after the Cold War ended, American defense spending remained enormous. The infrastructure, the weapons systems, the global network of bases, it all remained. America emerged as the sole superpower, with military capabilities dwarfing every other nation. This has shaped American foreign policy ever since. With overwhelming military power and no peer competitor, America has intervened in conflicts around the world, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously. The post-Cold War unipolar moment led to a sense that American power could reshape the world. Many of the conflicts fueled by the Cold War didn't end when the superpowers stopped supporting them. Afghanistan, after the Soviets withdrew and America lost interest, descended into civil war and eventually Taliban rule. Angola's civil war continued for years. Somalia collapsed into anarchy. The Cold War created or exacerbated instability in dozens of countries. Dictators propped up for Cold War reasons were suddenly cut loose. Countries where superpower proxy wars had raged were left devastated and armed. Regions where Cold War logic had prevented resolution of underlying conflicts, like the Middle East, remained unstable. The Cold War's end seemed to validate liberal democracy and free market capitalism. Francis Fukuyama famously declared the end of history, not that events would stop happening, but that ideological evolution had reached its endpoint in liberal democracy. The 1990s saw triumphalism in the West. But this was premature. Russia's transition to democracy and capitalism was chaotic and corrupt, creating oligarchy and nostalgia for Soviet stability. China remained communist politically while adopting capitalism economically, creating a hybrid system that challenged the assumption that capitalism requires democracy. And within the West, the benefits of globalization and capitalism weren't shared equally. Jobs moved overseas, inequality grew, communities dependent on industries that disappeared felt left behind. This has fueled populism and nationalism in recent years.
Perhaps most importantly, the post-Cold War period of American dominance is ending. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has reasserted itself, invading Georgia, annexing Crimea, intervening in Syria. China has risen to become an economic superpower and is challenging American dominance in Asia and globally. Some analysts argue we're entering a new Cold War, particularly between the US and China. It's different from the US-Soviet rivalry, more economic than ideological, without the nuclear brinksmanship so far, but it shares some features: great power competition, alliance building, competition for influence in the developing world, technological rivalry. Lessons we've learned, or should have. So what lessons does the Cold War teach us? What should we take from this 45-year struggle that shaped so much of the modern world? First, nuclear weapons change everything. The existence of weapons that can destroy civilization means that great power war has become potentially suicidal. This prevented World War III, but created decades of living with existential dread. Managing nuclear arsenals and preventing proliferation remains critical. Second, ideological certainty is dangerous. Both sides believed they possessed the truth about how society should be organized. This justified terrible things, supporting dictators, overthrowing democracies, proxy wars that killed millions.
A little humility about one's own system and a little understanding of others' perspectives might have prevented enormous suffering. Third, military power has limits. The United States lost in Vietnam. The Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan. Overwhelming military superiority couldn't win guerrilla wars against determined opponents fighting on their own soil. This lesson seems to need relearning every generation. Fourth, proxy wars have real victims. It was cold for the superpowers, but blazing hot for Koreans, Vietnamese, Angolans, Afghanis, and many others. When great powers use other countries as chessboards for their competition, real people suffer and die. The Cold War killed millions of people who had little stake in the ideological disputes between capitalism and communism. Fifth, economic vitality matters. The Soviet Union ultimately couldn't compete economically with the West. Its centrally planned economy couldn't innovate, couldn't satisfy consumer demands, couldn't match Western productivity. The lesson isn't that capitalism is perfect, it has major flaws, but that economic systems need flexibility, innovation, and some connection to actual human needs and wants. Sixth, people want freedom. When given the choice, people in Eastern Europe overwhelmingly chose democracy and freedom over communist control. This isn't to say Western democracy is perfect or that it works everywhere, but the basic human desire for freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and political participation is nearly universal. Seventh, change can happen peacefully. The Cold War could have ended in nuclear holocaust. Instead, it ended largely peacefully, with the Soviet system collapsing and most transitions occurring without massive violence. This wasn't inevitable. It required courage from leaders like Gorbachev, who chose reform over repression, and from people across Eastern Europe who protested peacefully. Eighth, we came terrifyingly close to disaster. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, during false alarms, during tense moments in various crises, we came within minutes or individual decisions of nuclear war. We survived the Cold War partly through luck. This should humble us and remind us how careful we must be with such devastating power. Where are we now? Today we live in a world shaped by the Cold War. The international institutions created during that era, the UN, NATO, the EU, still structure international relations. The technologies developed, computers, internet, satellites, nuclear power, define modern life. The conflicts created or frozen, Korea, Israel, Palestine, Kashmir, remain unresolved. Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer who called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, has tried to reclaim some Soviet glory. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has echoes of Cold War-era power politics, with Russia trying to maintain a sphere of influence and the West supporting Ukraine to resist. China presents a different challenge. It's economically integrated with the West in ways the Soviet Union never was, but politically authoritarian and increasingly assertive. The U.S.-China relationship will likely define 21st century geopolitics as much as the U.S.-Soviet relationship defined the 20th. And we still live under the nuclear shadow. The weapons remain, the doctrines remain. The danger, while less than during the Cold War's height, hasn't disappeared. New technologies, cyber weapons, artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, create new risks and challenges to strategic stability.
Let me bring you back to where we started. A world where children practiced duck and cover, where families built fallout shelters, where the fate of humanity balanced on the edge of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War was a conflict unlike any other. Two superpowers, armed with weapons that could end civilization, competed for global dominance for 45 years without directly fighting each other. It was fought through proxy wars that killed millions, espionage that read like spy novels, an arms race that seemed to have no limit,
a space race that put humans on the moon, and competition for hearts and minds across the globe. It divided the world. It divided Germany and Berlin with concrete walls and barbed wire. It divided families. It divided humanity into two camps, each convinced of its righteousness, each terrified of the other. The Cold War drove technological innovation at an unprecedented pace. The internet, GPS, satellite communications, advanced computers all emerged from Cold War military research. The space race gave us everything from satellite TV to memory foam. The existential threat pushed science forward. But the Cold War also corrupted. It turned local conflicts into proxy battles where superpower interests trumped local needs. It justified supporting dictators and overthrowing democracies. It led to surveillance states in both East and West. It created permanent military-industrial complexes that profited from continued tension. It poisoned politics with suspicion and paranoia. The people who lived through it, and for those of you old enough, this includes you, lived with psychological weight that's hard to fully explain to those who didn't experience it. The constant background awareness that nuclear war could happen at any moment. The drills, the movies about nuclear winter, the dreams about mushroom clouds. An entire generation grew up with this existential dread as the backdrop to their lives. And yet humanity survived. Not just survived, thrived in many ways. Despite the threat, despite the conflicts, people lived lives, raised families, created art, made scientific discoveries, built businesses, fell in love, pursued dreams. Life went on, even as the doomsday clock ticked close to midnight. When the Cold War ended, there was hope that the peace dividend, the resources no longer needed for military competition, would create a better world. There was talk of a new world order based on cooperation rather than competition. The 1990s saw optimism that democracy and prosperity would spread globally. Some of that happened. Millions were lifted out of poverty, particularly in China and India. Democracy spread to many countries. The internet connected the world. International cooperation on issues like climate change and global health became possible in new ways. But new challenges emerged. The euphoria of the Cold War's end gave way to new conflicts, terrorism, financial crises, rising inequality, climate change, and now potentially a new era of great power competition. The Cold War's greatest legacy might be this. It proved that humanity can face existential threats and not succumb to them. We built weapons capable of destroying everything, put them on hair-trigger alert, and, despite false alarms, miscommunications, and crises, we didn't use them. We stepped back from the brink. But it also proved how close we can come to disaster, how quickly things can escalate, how dangerous it is when fear and ideology override reason and common humanity. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, nuclear proliferation, great power competition, technological disruption, the Cold War offers both warnings and hope. Warning, these challenges can spiral out of control if we're not careful. Hope, humanity can navigate existential threats if we have the wisdom, courage, and luck to do so. The Cold War is over. The world it created is changing. But the lessons it taught about the dangers of ideological certainty, the limits of military power, the importance of communication, the resilience of people yearning for freedom, and the existential risks of nuclear weapons remain vitally relevant. We live in the long shadow of the Cold War. Understanding it helps us understand our world today, and perhaps, hopefully, helps us avoid repeating its mistakes while building on what was learned. The nuclear weapons remain. The challenges remain. But so does the human capacity for wisdom, courage, and hope. The Cold War showed us both our capacity for creating terrible threats and our ability to step back from using them. We survived the Cold War. The question now is, what will we do with the world it left us? Thank you for joining me on this journey through the entire history of the Cold War. If you found this valuable, please like, subscribe, and share. History has much to teach us if we're willing to listen. Until next time, remember, the past isn't just history, it's the foundation of our present and the teacher for our future.